Looking back in time to the Tudors and Stuarts landmarks, now on BBC Two, follows the raising of the Mary Rose.
In 1545, England and France were at war.
The French sent their fleet across the Channel to attack the English.
They anchored off the Isle of Wight.
Around Portsmouth, a great army gathered to drive the French back if they dared to land.
And Southsea Castle was armed with cannon.
King Henry VIII himself arrived to see his men in action.
Before long, the English fleet came sailing out of Portsmouth Harbour to meet the enemy.
The finest ship in King Henry's fleet was the Mary Rose.
She carried 90 guns and more than 700 men crowded aboard.
Every eye was on her as she turned to fire her cannons at the enemy.
Then disaster struck.
As she turned, water came pouring in through the open gun ports.
The ship began to heel.
Her great cannons broke loose and crashed across the deck.
In horror, King Henry watched as his favourite ship began to sink.
On board the Mary Rose, there was a terrible panic as men tried to escape.
Soldiers,
sailors,
archers,
gunners,
pikemen,
cooks,
noblemen,
surgeons,
carpenters,
boys as young as 12 and 13.
700 men all struggling to escape.
Of the 700 men, only a few survived. The rest died, trapped in their ship.
For more than 400 years, the Mary Rose lay buried at the bottom of the sea. Then in 1971, a team of divers and archaeologists saw traces of King Henry's flagship sticking up out of the soft mud. Over the next 10 years, the team uncovered the remains of the ship and rescued thousands of different objects. In 1982, work began to raise the Mary Rose herself. Fortunately, the remains of the ship were still immensely strong and could stand the strain of being lifted to the surface.
There is the wreck of the Mary Rose. It has come to the surface.
Wonderful moment.
The gun has gone off at Southsea. This historic moment as the Mary Rose comes to the surface. She's been on the seabed for 437 years.
The Mary Rose was finally lifted clear of the water and placed on a barge which brought her back into Portsmouth Harbour. Past Nelson's flagship HMS Victory and into a specially constructed building over No. 3 Dry Dock, the new home of the Mary Rose. The director of the trust which recovered the Mary Rose is Dr. Margaret Rule.
I'm an archaeologist. That is someone who tries to understand how people lived and worked in the past from the remains that they left behind them, either from their houses or the way they were buried or the way they farmed the land. I've been very fortunate that together with a team of archaeologists and divers, I was able to work on the Tudor warship Mary Rose.
It was a tremendously exciting time. I'd got fed up just sitting in a small support boat, making notes of what the divers had seen, and so I learned to dive myself. The day she went down, the Mary Rose was about to go into battle. One eyewitness account tells us that an extra 300 men had crowded on board the ship. Of those 700 individuals, we have recovered the remains of 200. An archaeologist is always hoping to find groups of objects, or objects which are related to each other in some way. For example, close to this fine wooden drinking pot were the remains of a small dog. Did the same man own them both, I wonder? And here are the bones of one of the men who drowned. His foot is still inside his shoe, and it has to be removed very carefully indeed. We can learn a great deal from the bones of those who died. For example, it's possible, by examining the ends of a bone, to see whether a man has stopped growing, whether he was still a young person or a fully grown adult. Anne Sterland specialises in studying human bones from excavations.
The youngest that I've encountered so far is an individual aged between 12 and 15 years, and the oldest is somebody at a rough estimate in their 40s. Predominantly, they're in the age range 18 to 24 years, which is, I suppose, what you would anticipate.
By measuring the length of his bones, it's possible to work out how tall a man was when he was alive. This graph shows the height of most of the men was between 167 centimetres and 172 centimetres, only slightly shorter than they are today. We can also find out about the size of the men on board the Mary Rose from the articles of clothing which have survived. One of the first things we did was to trace the outlines of each item onto a piece of polythene. We'd make a note of all the details, including stitching, and whether it was torn or mended. On this jerkin you can see the marks made by the lice comb the owner carried in an inside pocket. All the pieces of this jerkin were found together. You can still see how it was laced up the front using leather thongs. It had a large pocket fitted on the inside and was a very fashionable garment. The polythene reconstructions give us a good idea of the build of the men who wore the actual clothes. And here are some examples of the footwear worn by the men of the Mary Rose. Simple shoes and magnificent thigh boots. The soles of the boots were padded with straw. Archaeologists always take great care to record the positions in which objects are found. This mass of twisted metal and brick was in fact part of the ship's kitchen. In order to be able to reconstruct it, every brick was numbered and its position carefully noted down. Some of the things we found were unfamiliar or difficult to understand. Others were much easier to recognize.
It looks a bit like a saucepan, and I think it's made out of lead.
And it's got some funny things at the bottom, holding it up.
I think it could be used for cooking, where you put it on the stove, because it's got a gap at the bottom. It's deep inside, and it's all burnt.
So what might have gone inside this Tudor cooking pot? A good deal of evidence has been found, stored in wooden barrels. These are the bones of North Sea cod. They were probably salted in order to preserve them. Another barrel was full of beef, as Jenny Coy explains.
This is the contents of one of the casks. It shows that the meat was probably put up in portions, and that the portions probably correspond with these rather regular lengths of bone that you have. This is a rib, and the lengths of these are fairly standard and chopped at each end, and this shows that there was some portioning of the meat.
Without fridges to keep it fresh, the food must have tasted awful. So what did the sailors do? Frank Green has an idea.
This, in fact, is a sample of peppercorns, black pepper. Pepper was used for a variety of purposes, medicinal, herbal, and, of course, it was used as food flavouring. And it may well be that the average seaman even had a small quantity of pepper to flavour his rather boring food.
That pepper, in fact, belonged to one of the most important men on the Mary Rose, the ship's doctor or barber surgeon. We found his cabin on the main deck. Inside the cabin was a large box. It was unopened. I'd read in documents that each ship was supposed to have on board a medical kit, but to find one complete was truly wonderful. Here are some of the things we found inside. Ear scoops for taking wax out of the ear. Syringes for placing medicine inside the body. Medicine bottles, plates, dishes, bleeding bowls, and even a wooden pot containing ointment with the finger marks of the doctor's hand still inside. The Mary Rose was one of the most modern ships of her time, designed to carry heavy guns and fight at a distance. Previously, ships had closed together, and then the opposing crews had fought it out hand to hand. All that was now changing. This enormous bronze gun was lifted complete with its wooden carriage. In the days of King Henry VIII, this gun would have been lifted on board the Mary Rose in much the same way.
Davy, very gentle there.
When we cleaned the gun, we found it was loaded with solid iron shot and ready for firing. On the barrel of the cannon, you can see the badge of King Henry's family, the Tudor Rose. The cannons are spectacular, but equally important are the cannon balls that they've fired. Some are made of iron, some roughly hacked from a piece of stone. Gauges were needed to match each cannon with its shot. These pieces of flint are part of another weapon system. They are covered with razor-sharp edges. They were loaded into a wooden container and then fired at the enemy at point-blank range. At the Mary Rose Museum, we have reconstructed a section of the ship's gun deck. On the upper deck, we've placed an archer. Even as late as 1545, the longbow was still an important part of the ship's armoury. And here's our evidence. Chests like this containing 140 Tudor longbows, beautifully preserved in the fine mud of the Solent. From the wreck of the Mary Rose, we have found over 26,000 objects, from coils of rope used as an anchor cable to a tiny slate protractor that broke and was thrown away. A pocket sundial for telling the time. A ship's compass, missing its pointer, but still contained in a wooden box. A backgammon set. Lots of lice combs. Leather bottles. Knife handles, some of them carefully carved by their owner. A whistle, used for signalling on board the ship. Several thimbles, a die, and a manicure set, perhaps the property of a rich young nobleman. A pomander stuffed with sweet herbs to scent the air. A variety of jugs. In fact, everything the men needed for life on board the ship. Almost the last thing we found was the ship's bell. But the most important object of all was the remains of the Mary Rose herself.
Yes.
I've been looking at her with John Legg, who's a shipwright and very interested in examining in detail how the ship was built. We're at the stern of the ship, at the back, just above the rudder.
An awful lot of trees.
Oh, yes.
I worked out that if you took all the oak trees to build the Mary Rose and put them side by side, they'd cover 36 acres.
Quite a lot of trees.
That's why we haven't got many oak forests now,
That's
I suppose.
Right.
It took about 2 years to build the Mary Rose, and she was only built about 100 yards away. That must have been a major task, I think, for the craftsmen of Portsmouth.
I think there must have been quite a lot of men on them to build it in 2 years.
I think so.
The Mary Rose was repaired by several carpenters who lived here on the main deck. When we excavated, we found their cabin had a sliding door that was nearly shut. Inside we found 370 objects, most of them carpenters' tools. When they built the Mary Rose, they cut out all the sections of curved timber in the forest where they grew, and then they marked them, ready for assembly in the ship. We find lots of carpenters' marks, like this V, the Roman number 5. Before we raised the ship, we removed many of the smaller timbers. Each timber was numbered and surveyed before we moved it. Now we can begin the task of replacing all the half beams that supported the decks. Then we can put back the deck planking and rebuild the cabins, the companionways and the gun bays. And finally we can replace the upper deck. This will give the visitor a magnificent cross-section view of King Henry VIII's great warship, the Mary Rose. As we continue replacing these timbers, we discover more about the ship, and we come to respect those who built her and those who sailed in her.
And in addition to this problem of trying to understand the ship and the people, we also have to preserve her. And to do this, we keep her very cold and very wet for 20 hours every day. And normally she is sprayed with refrigerated, very cold water. And I'm going to ask them to turn the sprays on now.
Now on BBC